My husband divorced me, took my house, and stripped away my custody rights. You will never see the kids again. He laughed in the courtroom, while his lawyer brother-in-law patted his back. They thought I was a broke teaching assistant who mixed silly chemicals in the bathroom. I let them think I was completely ruined. What they did not know was that the very next day, their entire multi-million-dollar empire would collapse because I am the sole patent owner of their flagship product. Before I continue this story, let me know where you are watching from in the comments below. Hit like and subscribe if you love seeing a narcissistic ex-husband get exactly what he deserves. The heavy wooden gavel struck the sounding block with a sharp crack that echoed through the Fulton County family courtroom. That sound finalized the end of my marriage, and supposedly, the end of my life as I knew it. I am Maya, and at 34 years old, I was sitting at the defendant's table watching the man I spent 7 years supporting systematically strip me of everything I loved. The air in the courtroom was stifling and smelled of floor wax and old paper, but the coldness radiating from the other side of the room was what truly made me shiver. Marcus stood just a few feet away from me. He was adjusting the cuffs of his bespoke Italian suit, a suit paid for by the company I helped him build. He threw his head back and laughed, a loud, booming sound that felt like a physical strike against my cheek. Beside him stood Bradley, his brother-in-law and lead attorney. Bradley was a corporate shark who always made sure his white privilege was front and center in every room he entered. He draped his arm over Marcus' shoulder, grinning like they had just won a championship game. Marcus leaned across the heavy oak table, invading my space. His eyes were cold and devoid of any warmth I once thought existed there. "Sign the papers, Maya," he whispered, his voice dripping with venom. "You lose the Buckhead mansion. You lose custody of Malik and Zuri. With that pathetic teaching assistant salary of yours, you will never see them again." He pushed the thick stack of legal documents closer to me. The very documents that would sever my ties to my own children and my rights to sterling naturals. My hands rested on the table, trembling slightly. I made sure to let them tremble. I needed Marcus to see a broken woman. I needed him to believe his cruelty had completely shattered my spirit. "You really think you can just walk away with my children?" I asked, keeping my voice low and fragile. Marcus scoffed, leaning closer, so only I could hear the malice in his tone. "I am not walking away, Maya. I am taking them. The court agrees with me. Look at you. You are a mess. You cannot even afford a decent lawyer. What kind of mother can provide for 2 kids on a biochemist stipend? I am giving them the life they deserve, the life I built." He puffed out his chest, standing tall in his expensive shoes. He actually thought he was a self-made visionary. He actually believed his marketing speeches and social media followers were the true foundation of his wealth. Bradley stepped forward, resting his manicured hands on the documents. His condescending tone was something I had endured at family dinners for years. "Let us be realistic here," Maya, Bradley said smoothly. "The psychological evaluation clearly shows you are mentally unstable. We have documented your long hours locked in the bathroom, obsessing over your little chemical mixtures instead of caring for the children. And financially speaking, you are completely incapable of providing the lifestyle Malik and Zuri are accustomed to." He tapped the signature line with a gold pen. "The court sees the truth. You are unfit." I stared at Bradley, feeling a familiar rage boiling deep in my chest. This man had spent the last 6 months twisting my dedication into a weapon against me. Those long hours locked in the bathroom were not signs of mental instability. I was a biochemist. I was formulating the exact hair growth serum that had just generated $20 million in revenue for Sterling Naturals last year. But Bradley had buried that fact in a mountain of legal jargon, characterizing my late-night lab work as severe parental neglect. He had hired a biased psychiatrist to paint my exhaustion as depression and my intense focus as mania. They had frozen our joint accounts, leaving me with nothing but a meager university stipend. They starved me out financially, so I could not hire a lawyer capable of fighting Bradley and his high-powered firm. "You know those documents are full of lies," I said softly, looking from Bradley back to Marcus. "You know I built the formula. You know I stayed up night after night perfecting the exact ratio of ingredients while you were out at networking events taking all the credit." Marcus just rolled his eyes, a gesture so dismissive it made my blood run cold. Nobody cares about your kitchen experiments, Maya. I am the CEO. I am the face of Sterling Naturals. I built the brand. I secured the investors. I made the connections that turned your little hobby into a real business. Now be a good girl and sign so we can all go home. I have a very important merger meeting to prepare for, and your theatrics are wasting my time. I was talking about the upcoming merger with a massive French cosmetics conglomerate, a deal that would make him richer than he ever imagined. He thought pushing me out right before the deal closed was a brilliant strategic move. He thought he was cutting dead weight. I looked down at the line requiring my signature. By signing this, I was officially forfeiting all marital claims to Sterling Naturals. I was accepting supervised weekend visits with my own 8- and 6-year-old children. I was walking away from the sprawling estate in Buckhead that I had personally decorated and turned into a home. The absolute injustice of it all threatened to consume me, but I swallowed the scream building in my throat. I had to play the long game. I had to be smarter than their arrogance. Bradley tapped the pen against the table again, his impatience showing. The judge is waiting, Maya. Do not make this harder on yourself. You African American women always let your emotions cloud your judgment when it comes to business. Just sign the paper and accept that Marcus won. You will get your alimony and you can go back to your quiet little life. The blatant disrespect, the casual racism masked as legal advice. It took every ounce of self-control I possessed not to reach across the table and strike him. But a true queen does not engage in petty brawls when she is preparing to win a war. I picked up the pen. The metal felt cold against my fingers. I let one single tear fall onto the paper perfectly timed for maximum effect. I let my hand shake as I pressed the tip of the pen to the signature line. Are you sure this is what you want, Marcus? I asked, looking up at him through my tears. Are you absolutely sure you want to take everything? Marcus smiled a wide, predatory grin that showed all his teeth. I am positive, Maya. Now sign. So I signed. I signed my name in blue ink, officially handing over the company, the house, and temporary custody of my children. I handed the paperwork to Bradley, who snatched it away with a triumphant smirk. He quickly reviewed the signatures and nodded at Marcus, giving him the silent confirmation that the deed was done. Marcus let out a long breath of relief, acting as if he had just survived a grueling battle instead of orchestrating a massacre. You did the right thing, Maya, Marcus said, adjusting his tie. It is better for everyone this way, especially the kids. They need stability, not a mother who cannot even afford her own groceries. I stood up slowly, pushing my chair back. The wood scraped against the floor, echoing in the large room. I gathered my cheap purse and my worn coat. I did not look broken anymore. The tears were gone, instantly replaced by a mask of complete indifference. I walked past them without saying another word. Let them celebrate their stolen victory. Let them drink their expensive champagne and toast to my downfall. They had absolutely no idea that the signature I just provided was the exact trigger needed to arm the trap I had set. I pushed open the heavy double doors of the courtroom and stepped out into the busy hallway. The sounds of other people's tragedies and legal battles washed over me, but I felt completely insulated in my own silent resolve. My phone buzzed in my pocket, but I ignored it. I walked down the marble steps of the courthouse, feeling the humid Atlanta air hit my face as I exited the building. I walked toward my car, a rusted 10-year-old Honda that I had borrowed from a friend. Marcus had taken my luxury SUV, claiming it was a company asset. I climbed into the driver's seat and gripped the steering wheel tightly. My knuckles turned white, but my breathing was perfectly steady. I looked back at the courthouse building, standing tall against the gray sky. They thought they had outsmarted me. They thought my silence was submission, and my tears were surrender. Marcus believed his business degree, and Bradley believed his law degree made them invincible against a woman who spent her days in a laboratory. But science teaches you patience. Science teaches you that every action has a precise and unavoidable reaction. I started the engine and the car sputtered to life. I had lost the battle today, but the war was already won. Marcus wanted to be the sole owner of Sterling Naturals. He wanted the glory and the millions that came with the upcoming French merger. What he did not realize was that by forcing me out and claiming sole ownership under fraudulent terms, he had just violated the very foundation of his own company. I drove away from the courthouse, leaving my old life behind, ready to execute the next phase of my plan. Before I could even pull out the key to unlock the rusted door of my borrowed Honda, the sharp, rapid clicking of designer heels echoed across the concrete of the Fulton County Courthouse parking deck. The heavy Atlanta humidity was already pressing down on my shoulders, making the cheap fabric of my thrifted blouse stick to my skin. I did not need to turn around to know who was marching toward me with that characteristic frantic energy. It was Chloe, my beloved sister-in-law, the woman who had spent the last 7 years making sure I never forgot that I was a girl from the south side of Chicago who had somehow tricked her brilliant brother into marriage. I kept my back to her for a moment, taking a slow, measured breath. I needed to keep the mask of the defeated, broken woman firmly in place for just a few more minutes. When I finally turned, Chloe was standing less than 2 feet away. She was wearing a pristine white Chanel suit that probably cost more than the car I was leaning against. Her edges were laid perfectly, her hair cascading in flawless waves down her back. Hair that I had personally saved from ruin. She looked me up and down, her lip curling in a sneer of pure disgust. The satisfaction radiating from her was almost a physical force. She reached into her immaculate leather handbag and pulled out a small, crisp slip of paper. With a flick of her wrist, she threw it directly at my face. The piece of paper fluttered against my cheek and drifted down to the oil-stained concrete between my cheap flats. "Pick it up," Chloe commanded, her voice echoing in the empty parking structure. "Consider it a parting gift from the family. It is $5,000. Take it and go find yourself a roach-infested apartment in whatever neighborhood you crawled out of." I looked down at the check, then back up at her, keeping my eyes wide and my lower lip trembling. I did not say a word, which only seemed to fuel her arrogant rage. "Marcus has been carrying your dead weight for 7 years, she spat, taking a step closer. 7 years, Maya. He put a roof over your head, clothed you, fed you, and elevated you to a status you had no business occupying. And what did you do in return? You locked yourself in a bathroom mixing up your little homemade potions. You played pretend scientist with your cheap beakers and your essential oils, while my brother was out in the real world, building a multi-million-dollar empire from scratch." She crossed her arms, looking at me as if I were something foul she had stepped in. "You actually thought you contributed something of value to Sterling Naturals. You are delusional. Anyone can mix shea butter and peppermint oil in a kitchen sink. Marcus is a visionary. He took your little hobby and turned it into a brand. He secured the supply chains. He got us into retail stores. He did the work. And now that the company is about to merge with the biggest cosmetics conglomerate in Europe, you honestly thought you were going to ride his coattails to the top." She let out a harsh, mocking laugh. "You thought you were going to be the wife of a billionaire CEO. You thought you were going to ring the bell on Wall Street. But the truth is, you were never anything more than a glorified maid who knew how to stir a pot. Now you have nothing. No husband, no house, no company, and no children. Do not ever try to contact my brother or my niece and nephew again. You do not belong in our world anymore." I let her finish. I let her breathe in the toxic fumes of her own ego. And then very slowly I stopped crying. The trembling in my hands ceased completely. I straightened my posture, rolling my shoulders back, until I was looking down at her, stripping away the fragile facade I had maintained inside the courtroom. I looked at her flawless hairline, the beautiful thick hair framing her face. "You know, Chloe," I said, my voice dropping its shaky pitch and returning to its natural, steady resonance, "it is funny you call my work a little hobby, because I remember a very different version of you 5 years ago. I remember you coming to my kitchen sobbing so hard you could barely breathe because your hair was falling out in clumps. I remember the severe traction alopecia that had left you completely bald around your temples. You were wearing wigs that kept slipping, and you were too embarrassed to even leave the house." Chloe's smug expression faltered for a fraction of a second, her eyes darting away nervously, but I did not let her look away. I stepped forward, closing the distance between us, forcing her to look me in the eye. "I remember creating a specific complex molecular formula, using active peptides and biotin complexes, something your brother could not even spell, let alone invent. I remember curing your baldness with that exact same chemical mixture you just called a homemade potion. And more importantly, I reminded her, my voice turning to ice. I remember that my little hobby was the sole reason Sterling Naturals generated $20 million in pure profit last year. $20 million, Chloe. Marcus did not formulate that serum. He did not stabilize the active ingredients. I did. He is just a salesman reading off a script I wrote for him. How dare you? She hissed, her face flushing a deep, ugly shade of red. She raised her hand as if to slap me, but she stopped when she saw the completely dead, unblinking look in my eyes. I was not the terrified woman from the courtroom anymore. I was a scientist analyzing a highly predictable, easily manipulated specimen. Keep your $5,000, Chloe, I said calmly, kicking the check back toward her expensive shoes. You are going to need every single penny of it very, very soon. Tell your brother I said congratulations on the merger. I hope he enjoys the spotlight. I turned my back on her before she could formulate another insult. I unlocked the heavy door of the Honda, ignoring the loud screeching sound the metal made, and slid into the driver's seat. Through the dusty window, I watched Chloe snatch the check off the ground, her face twisted in a mask of pure hatred. She shouted something I could not hear through the glass, turned on her heel, and stomped away toward the luxury vehicles parked on the upper deck. I waited until she was completely out of sight. I sat in the stifling heat of the old car, listening to the rhythmic ticking of the engine. The adrenaline was slowly fading, leaving behind a sharp, crystal-clear focus. They really believed they had won. They truly believed they had legally severed me from my own creation. Marcus and his corporate shark of a brother-in-law, Bradley, thought their ironclad contracts and aggressive courtroom tactics had stripped me of my rights to the Sterling Naturals flagship formula. I reached over to the passenger seat and unzipped my cheap, worn-out purse. I pushed aside my wallet and a pack of tissues, reaching deep into the hidden lining at the bottom. My fingers brushed against a small, hard object. I pulled it out and held it up into the dim light of the parking garage. It was a simple silver USB flash drive. It looked like something a college student would use to store term papers. But this tiny piece of metal held the digital keys to an empire. It held the truth that Marcus, in all his arrogant glory, had completely overlooked during our entire marriage. When I developed the liquid gold hair restoration formula 5 years ago, I did not just hand it over to Marcus. I was a scientist, yes, but I was not a fool. Before I ever let Marcus bottle my serum and put the Sterling Naturals label on it, I quietly took a trip to a patent attorney. I registered the exact chemical formula, the proprietary blending process, and the intellectual property rights. But I did not register it under my name, and I certainly did not register it under Sterling Naturals. I registered the patent under a completely separate anonymous holding company called Phoenix Genesis LLC. I am the sole owner and managing director of Phoenix Genesis. Sterling Naturals does not own the formula. They never did. They simply licensed the right to use it from my holding company. And buried deep within the licensing agreement, hidden in a maze of boilerplate text that Marcus was too arrogant to read carefully, was a very specific termination clause. A clause that stated the licensing agreement would immediately become null and void if the CEO of Sterling Naturals was found guilty of marital fraud, or if the company attempted any major structural merger without the explicit written consent of the IP owner. Marcus just finalized our divorce by claiming I had no part in the business. He just took my children by claiming I was financially destitute. I was weeks away from selling a company for $150 million, a company whose only valuable asset belonged entirely to me. I plugged the USB drive into my phone using an adapter. The screen lit up, displaying the encrypted legal documents, the copyright registrations, and the unassailable proof of my ownership. I let out a long, slow breath, a genuine smile finally touching the corners of my mouth. Marcus and Bradley had just spent months orchestrating my removal, thinking they were clearing the path for their massive French merger. Instead, they had just walked blindly into a legal slaughterhouse. I put the car in gear and drove out of the parking structure, merging onto the busy Atlanta streets. I was heading to a cheap motel tonight, but that was just temporary. Let Marcus sleep in the Buckhead mansion. Let him bring his Instagram models into my home, and let Chloe parade around in her designer suits. They had exactly 90 days before the French auditors demanded to see the intellectual property rights. The countdown had officially begun, and I was going to enjoy watching every single second of their spectacular, catastrophic ruin. I drove back onto the highway, the rhythmic thrum of the rusted Honda's engine, a stark contrast to the sleek, silent ride of the luxury vehicles I was used to. The GPS on my phone directed me toward the outskirts of Atlanta, far away from the manicured lawns and gated communities of Buckhead. I was heading to a cheap short-term rental apartment in a neighborhood where the streetlights flickered and the security consisted of a deadbolt and a prayer. 30 minutes later, I pulled into the cracked asphalt parking lot of a grim beige brick building. I carried my 3 cardboard boxes up 2 flights of stairs, the scent of stale cigarette smoke and cheap bleach lingering in the narrow hallway. I unlocked the door to Unit 2B and stepped inside. The apartment was tiny, furnished with a worn brown sofa, a rickety dining table, and a bed that looked like it had survived a war. It was a massive fall from grace. Yesterday I was the lady of a multi-million-dollar estate. Today I was standing in a room where the floorboards creaked under my weight. But looking around the cramped space, I didn't feel despair. I felt a profound, exhilarating sense of freedom. There were no arrogant husbands here to claim credit for my brilliance. There were no judgmental in-laws to scrutinize my every move. There was only me, my intellect, and the quiet space I needed to execute the final stages of my plan. I set the boxes down, walked over to the small laminate kitchen counter, and pulled the silver USB drive from my purse. I plugged it into my laptop, the screen illuminating the dim room. I opened the encrypted folder labeled Phoenix Genesis LLC. The documents were beautifully thorough. Years ago, before Marcus ever brought his first investor to the dining room table, I had secured the legal counsel of Ms. Evelyn Davis. Evelyn was a brilliant, ruthless African-American intellectual property attorney who operated out of a high-rise in Midtown. She knew the corporate game, she knew how men like Marcus and Bradley operated, and she had meticulously structured my holding company to be an impenetrable fortress. I opened my email client and drafted a new message directly to Evelyn. The divorce is finalized. He took the bait. Initiate phase 2. Alert the French auditors of the pending IP conflict. Let's burn it down. I hit send, the swoosh sound of the departing email feeling like the starting gun of a race I had already won. Before I could close the laptop, my phone lit up with a notification. It was a direct text message from Marcus. I had blocked him in the family group chat, but he was using his secondary business number. I stared at the screen, watching the preview text scroll across the glass. You seriously think blocking us changes anything? Malik won't stop crying, and it's your fault for making a scene at the courthouse. You're traumatizing them with your instability. I'm taking them to Aspen next week with Destiny so they can forget about this mess. Don't bother calling. The nanny has strict instructions not to put you through. I was actively trying to sever my bond with my own children. He wanted to replace me with a 22-year-old Instagram model before the week was out. He wanted Malik and Zuri to view me as the unstable, absent mother, while he played the wealthy, heroic father. I didn't reply. Engaging with a narcissist when they are high on their own supply is a waste of energy. I simply took a screenshot of the message and forwarded it to a private folder I shared with Evelyn. Every threat, every attempt at parental alienation, every arrogant text message was being cataloged for the impending custody battle. My phone buzzed again, this time with an incoming call from an unknown number. I let it ring twice before answering. Maya, a sharp, authoritative female voice came through the speaker. It was Evelyn. I just got your email, Evelyn said, skipping the pleasantries. I have the cease and desist letters drafted. I've also reached out to my contacts at the SEC. Since Marcus is attempting to push through a merger involving an IP he doesn't own, we can flag this for federal review. But I need to confirm, are you absolutely certain you want to pull the trigger now? The French conglomerate is scheduled to sign the preliminary agreements next Friday. If we hit them with the IP audit request now, Sterling Naturals will hemorrhage value overnight. Marcus will be personally liable for the investor fallout. I want him liable for every single cent, I said, my voice cold and unwavering in the empty apartment. He didn't just steal my company, Evelyn. He stole my children. He told me today that I would never see them again because I don't have the financial means to fight him. Evelyn let out a low, dark chuckle. Well, he clearly forgot who he married. Bradley has been acting as lead counsel for Sterling Naturals, correct? Yes, I confirmed. He handled the initial licensing agreement between Phoenix Genesis and Sterling. Perfect, Evelyn said, the satisfaction evident in her tone. Bradley signed off on the due diligence. When the French auditors realize he missed the termination clause regarding marital fraud, he won't just lose this deal. He'll face a malpractice suit that will cost him his license. He's going down right alongside Marcus. That's exactly what I want. Consider it done, Evelyn said. Get some rest, Maya. You've got a long 90 days ahead of you, and I need you sharp when they finally realize the building is on fire and the doors are locked from the outside. I ended the call and closed the laptop. The silence of the apartment washed over me, heavy but peaceful. I walked into the tiny bathroom and turned on the faucet, splashing cold water on my face. I looked in the mirror. The woman staring back at me wasn't a victim. She wasn't a struggling teaching assistant or a neglected wife. She was a CEO. She was a mother who was about to scorch the earth to get her children back. The next few days passed in a blur of calculated silence. I ignored the taunting messages from Chloe, who took great pleasure in sending me pictures of Destiny redecorating the Buckhead mansion. I ignored the passive-aggressive emails from Marcus's financial team, demanding I return the company laptop I had already wiped clean. I focused entirely on my work, spending my days at the university lab, quietly developing the next generation of formulas for Phoenix Genesis. Sterling Naturals was the past. Phoenix Genesis was the future. By Wednesday of the following week, the atmosphere in Atlanta's corporate circles began to shift. It started as a faint tremor, a whisper in the financial columns of the local business journals. I was sitting at a coffee shop near the university reviewing peptide structures when a notification popped up on my phone. It was an alert from an industry news app I monitored. The headline made my heart give a single triumphant thump. Sterling Naturals, L'Etoile Beauty merger hits unexpected snag, European conglomerate demands immediate IP audit. I clicked on the article. The text detailed how L'Etoile Beauty, the massive French company Marcus was trying to partner with, had suddenly halted all negotiations. An anonymous source cited severe irregularities regarding the core patents of Sterling Naturals' flagship products. The French executives had demanded a full independent audit of the intellectual property ownership before proceeding with the $150 million acquisition. Marcus's entire empire was built on the illusion of ownership. Now the curtain was being pulled back and the spotlight was shining directly on the empty stage. My phone screen illuminated with an incoming call. The caller ID flashed a name I hadn't seen on my screen in months, but one I had fully expected to see today. It was Bradley. I took a sip of my coffee, let it ring 3 times, and then calmly answered. Hello, Bradley. Maya. Bradley's voice came through the line, tight, strained, and stripped of all the condescending swagger he had paraded in the courtroom just days ago. We have a problem. I asked, feigning innocent confusion. I don't believe we have anything, Bradley. You made sure of that last week. Cut the crap, Maya. He snapped, his breathing shallow. I just got off a conference call with the legal team from L'Etoile. They're demanding to see the original patent filings for the liquid gold formula. They're claiming they received an anonymous tip that Sterling Naturals doesn't hold the primary rights. I need you to send me the original lab notebooks and the registration files you filed 5 years ago. I know you have them. I do have them, I said smoothly, but I'm afraid I can't send them to you. Why the hell not? Bradley demanded, his voice rising in panic. Maya, if we don't clear this up by Friday, the French are going to pull out. The investors will panic. The stock will tank. You need to send me those files right now. I can't send them to you, Bradley, because Sterling Naturals doesn't own those files, I said, leaning back in my chair, enjoying the absolute silence that followed on his end of the line. Phoenix Genesis LLC owns them, and as the sole managing director of Phoenix Genesis, I have officially revoked your licensing agreement due to a breach of contract. What? What are you talking about? Bradley stammered, the realization slowly dawning on him. Phoenix Genesis, that's just a shell company Marcus set up for tax purposes. No, Bradley. I corrected, my voice cold and precise. Phoenix Genesis is the holding company I set up before I ever gave Marcus the formula. I own 100% of the equity. And if you had bothered to read the licensing agreement you drafted 5 years ago, instead of spending your time belittling me at family dinners, you would have noticed the termination clause regarding marital fraud. Marcus lied in his financial disclosures during the divorce. He claimed I contributed nothing to the company. That's fraud, Bradley. And it triggers the immediate termination of his right to sell my product. I could hear Bradley choking on his own breath. The corporate shark was drowning in a puddle of his own incompetence. You set us up, he whispered, the panic fully setting in. I didn't set you up, I replied. I just read the fine print. Something they apparently don't teach at Harvard Law. Have a terrible afternoon, Bradley. And tell Marcus to check his email. My lawyers just sent over the official cease and desist. I hung up the phone and took another sip of my coffee. The French auditors were knocking. Bradley was panicking, and Marcus was about to discover that the woman he threw out on the street was the only one holding the keys to his castle. I pulled the rusted Honda up to the wrought iron gates of the Buckhead mansion. The heavy metal doors swung open, granting me access to the estate I had designed, paid for with my formulas, and maintained for the last 7 years. The tires crunched over the pristine white gravel of the circular driveway. I parked behind a sleek black Range Rover that definitely did not belong to Marcus. Taking a deep breath, I grabbed my keys and walked up the sweeping limestone steps. When I unlocked the mahogany front door, the first thing that hit me was the scent. The signature lavender and cedarwood fragrance I had custom blended for the foyer was gone, replaced by the overpowering stench of cheap vanilla perfume. I stepped into the grand entryway fully expecting to see Marcus, or perhaps his new 22-year-old Instagram obsession flaunting my bathrobe. Instead, I found a much more insidious presence waiting for me. Bradley stood in the center of the marble floor. He was flanked by 2 massive private security contractors in matching black suits. Bradley held a crystal tumbler filled with my expensive scotch, swirling the amber liquid with an infuriatingly relaxed rhythm. He wore his usual custom-tailored navy suit, looking every bit the predatory corporate lawyer he was. "Welcome home, Maya," he said, his voice dripping with condescension. "Or rather, welcome to Marcus's home. I am just here as a courtesy to ensure the transition goes smoothly and without any unnecessary property damage." I stared at him, keeping my expression perfectly neutral. I did not ask why he was drinking my liquor. I did not ask why 2 armed guards were treating me like a hostile intruder in the house I had decorated. I simply walked past them toward the sweeping spiral staircase. Bradley fell into step behind me, the heavy thuds of the security guards echoing against the marble. "We need to establish some ground rules before you go digging through the closets," Maya Bradley announced, his tone shifting from mock politeness to cold authority. "The court order clearly stipulates that you forfeited all assets purchased with company funds. That means the jewelry stays. The designer bags stay. The artwork, the electronics, and the luxury vehicles all stay. You are permitted to take your personal clothing and items of negligible financial value. That is it." I reached the master bedroom and pushed the door open. The room was a disaster. My personal items had been carelessly shoved into a corner, while unfamiliar shopping bags from high-end boutiques littered the velvet settee. I walked directly to the massive walk-in closet, ignoring the absolute disrespect of it all. Bradley leaned against the doorframe, taking a slow sip of his scotch. He was enjoying this. He fed on the power dynamic, thriving on the ability to legally strip a woman of color down to nothing. "You know, Maya, I have handled dozens of these high-net-worth divorces," he said, his voice echoing in the cavernous closet. "And I always see the same pattern with you people." I stopped folding a faded college sweatshirt but did not turn around. I let him keep talking. I needed him to feel completely uninhibited. "American law does not protect emotional people," Bradley continued, swirling his glass again. "It protects the pragmatic. It protects the visionaries. You African American women are always so quick to let your feelings dictate your actions. You scream, you cry, you demand respect instead of commanding it. You let your pride blind you to how the real world operates. And that is exactly why I was able to crush you in that courtroom today." I picked up an empty cardboard box and began placing my plain cotton shirts inside. I did not touch the row of Chanel jackets or the Dior dresses Marcus had bought for me to wear to his corporate galas. Those were uniforms for a role I no longer played. "I used the white man's law to dismantle your entire life," Bradley said, stepping further into the closet. His microaggressions were no longer subtle. They were blunt instruments he was using to try and provoke a reaction. He wanted me to scream. He wanted me to throw something so his guards could physically restrain me and drag me out. It would validate every racist, sexist stereotype he held in his mediocre mind. "I proved that you were unstable," he sneered. "I proved that you neglected your children to play with your little chemistry sets. I took your house, your company, and your kids, using nothing but standard legal precedent. You thought you could sit at the big table because you mixed a decent hair serum. But this is the major leagues, Maya. You were out of your depth the moment you signed that marriage license." I finished taping the first box and moved on to the second. I packed a pair of worn-out jeans from my days as a teaching assistant. I packed a simple silver locket my grandmother had given me. I packed the faded sneakers I wore when I spent 18 hours a day standing in the lab perfecting the liquid gold formula. "Are you even listening to me?" Bradley demanded, his voice rising in frustration. My absolute silence was unnerving him. He needed friction to feel powerful, and I was giving him nothing but a vacuum. I taped the second box closed and started on the third. I moved methodically, efficiently, packing only the items that belonged to Maya the scientist, not Maya the billionaire wife. "Look at you," Bradley scoffed, attempting to regain his footing. "Grabbing your pathetic little rags. Go ahead. Take your 3 cardboard boxes of old clothes and get out of my sight. Be a good girl and leave quietly before I have my men physically throw you onto the street. You have lost Maya. Accept it." I taped the third and final box closed. I stood up and smoothed the wrinkles from my cheap blouse. I walked over to the jewelry safe built into the custom cabinetry. I opened it, revealing millions of dollars worth of diamonds, emeralds, and gold. I took off my diamond engagement ring and placed it gently on the velvet lining. I closed the safe and spun the dial, locking it tight. I turned to face Bradley. He was standing close, trying to use his physical size to intimidate me. I looked up at him, my eyes clear and completely devoid of fear. I did not yell. I did not cry. I simply gave him a soft, chilling smile. I nodded my head once in polite acknowledgement of his entire speech. Then I picked up the first box, walked past him, and handed it to one of the massive security guards. The guard looked confused, glancing at Bradley for direction. Before Bradley could object, I handed the second box to the other guard. I picked up the third box myself. "Thank you for your help, gentlemen," I said pleasantly. "I appreciate the escort." I walked down the grand staircase, leaving Bradley standing in the master bedroom, completely baffled by my reaction. He had expected a hysterical, broken woman. Instead, he got a woman who treated his armed guards like personal movers. I walked out the front door, the guards trailing behind me with my boxes. They loaded them into the trunk of the rusted Honda. I tipped each of them a crumpled $5 bill from my purse. They accepted the money in stunned silence. I got into the driver's seat and started the engine. As I pulled away from the Buckhead mansion, I looked in the rearview mirror. Bradley was standing on the limestone steps, his jaw tight, his drink forgotten in his hand. He thought he had just supervised the tragic exit of a defeated woman. He had absolutely no idea that he had just watched the CEO of Phoenix Genesis calmly extract herself from the blast radius. Just as my hand touched the scorching metal of the Honda door handle, the massive mahogany front doors of the mansion swung open. I froze, the oppressive Atlanta humidity suddenly feeling like ice against my skin. Marcus stepped out onto the sprawling limestone portico. He was not alone. I was tightly gripping the hands of my children. Malik, my brave 8-year-old boy, and Zuri, my sweet 6-year-old girl. They looked small and uncertain, standing on the grand threshold of the house I had turned into a home for them. Just behind Marcus, hovering in the shadows of the foyer, was Destiny. The Instagram model had shed my bathrobe and was now wearing a pair of my vintage Dior sunglasses pushed up into her bleached blonde hair. She leaned against the doorframe, sipping a green juice from one of my crystal glasses, watching the scene unfold with a bored, vacant expression. Marcus was putting on a masterful performance. He puffed out his chest, adjusting his designer polo shirt, playing the role of the stable, benevolent patriarch, forced to deal with an unstable ex-wife. He wanted Destiny to see him as a hero. He wanted Bradley lingering security guards to witness his absolute control over the situation. "Come on, kids!" Marcus called out, his voice artificially loud and laced with a sickeningly sweet tone that made my stomach turn. "Come say goodbye to your mother." She has to go away for a little while. She needs to go live somewhere else so she can figure some things out and get better. The blatant psychological manipulation, the casual way he was branding me as mentally deficient in front of our children, threatened to break the iron restraint I had maintained all afternoon. My hands curled into fists by my sides, my fingernails biting into my palms. I could not let him provoke me. I could not give him the hysterical reaction he desperately craved. Zuri clutched a small plush rabbit, her big brown eyes wide with confusion. She did not fully grasp the finality of what was happening. She simply knew the energy in the air was terrifying. But Malik was older. He understood enough to know that my car was packed with boxes and that I was not coming back inside for dinner. Malik looked from Marcus down to the rusted Honda, and then his eyes locked onto mine. His lower lip trembled. He ripped his hand out of his father-tight grip and sprinted down the limestone steps, his small sneakers slapping against the pristine white gravel. "Mommy," he screamed, his voice cracking with pure unfiltered panic. "Do not go. Please do not leave us here." I dropped to my knees on the harsh gravel, ignoring the sharp stones biting into my bare skin. I threw my arms open and caught him as he slammed into my chest. He wrapped his small arms around my neck, burying his face in my shoulder, sobbing so hard his entire body shook. I closed my eyes, burying my nose in his hair, breathing in the scent of his strawberry shampoo. The physical pain of holding him, knowing I had to let him go, was an agony so profound it defied description. It felt as though someone was reaching into my chest and crushing my heart with their bare hands. Zuri broke away from Marcus a moment later, running down the steps to join us. I pulled her into the embrace, wrapping my arms around both of my children, kneeling in the dirt of my own driveway. Zuri began to cry simply because her brother was crying, burying her wet face in my neck. I looked up over their heads. Marcus was standing at the top of the stairs, his arms crossed over his chest, a triumphant smirk playing on his lips. He was enjoying my devastation. He thought this was my absolute surrender. He believed he had successfully ripped my heart out and paraded it in front of his new mistress. I tightened my grip on my children. I could not afford to cry. I could not let them see me broken because they needed my strength to survive the coming storm. I leaned in, pressing my lips against Malik's ear, and then against Zuri's cheek. I took a slow, deep breath, forcing my voice to remain perfectly steady, perfectly clear, and entirely devoid of fear. "Listen to me, my beautiful babies," I whispered, my voice a fierce private vow, meant only for their ears. "I am not leaving you. I am just going to prepare something very special. You have to be strong for a little while. You have to be brave. But I promise you, I am coming back. I will come back for you in a golden carriage. Count exactly 90 days for mommy. 90 days, do you hear me?" Malik sniffled, pulling back just enough to look me in the eyes. His small face was streaked with tears, but he nodded, absorbing the absolute certainty in my voice. 90 days, he whispered back, his voice trembling but brave. I kissed his forehead and wiped the tears from Zuri's cheeks. I stood up slowly, my knees aching from the gravel. I did not look at Marcus. I did not look at Destiny. I kept my eyes entirely on my children, memorizing the exact shade of their eyes, the exact curve of their faces. I turned around and opened the heavy creaking door of the Honda. I slid into the driver's seat and started the ignition. The engine sputtered loudly, shattering the quiet elegance of the Buckhead estate. I put the car in gear and slowly pulled away from the portico. I looked in my rearview mirror, watching the scene shrink behind me. The massive wrought iron gates slowly swung shut, separating me from the sprawling mansion. Through the glass I could see the isolated image of my two small children standing on the vast expanse of white gravel, their father standing behind them like a prison warden. The profound isolation of that image burned itself into my retinas. I drove for 45 minutes, navigating away from the manicured lawns and luxury boutiques of my former life. I drove until the roads grew rougher, the streetlights dimmer, and the buildings more neglected. I finally pulled into the cracked parking lot of a dilapidated apartment complex on the outskirts of the city. The beige paint was peeling, the metal stairs were rusted, and the air smelled heavily of exhaust fumes and damp earth. I carried my 3 cardboard boxes up to the second floor and unlocked the door to Unit 4B. The apartment was a tiny claustrophobic square. The linoleum floor was scuffed, a single flickering fluorescent tube illuminated the stained galley kitchen, and a heavily worn sofa sat in the center of the cramped living room. The silence in the room was absolute, a deafening contrast to the vibrant, chaotic life of the mansion I had just left. I did not sit on the sofa. I did not unpack my clothes. I did not shed a single tear for the life I had just lost. I walked directly to the small scratched dining table and set down my worn leather purse. I pulled out my laptop, resting it on the uneven surface. I plugged it into the wall outlet and connected to the building unsecured wireless network. The screen flared to life, casting a harsh blue glow across the dark room. I opened my encrypted email client. I did not have to wait long. At exactly 6 o'clock, a new message appeared in my inbox. It was sent from the senior partner at one of the most ruthless, high-powered intellectual property law firms in New York City. The firm I had quietly retained using the anonymous funds from Phoenix Genesis. The subject line was blank. I clicked open the email. The message contained only 2 sentences. It was the confirmation I needed. The confirmation that the trap had been perfectly flawlessly sprung. Secret clause activated. Sterling Naturals is now selling illegal products. I stared at the glowing words on the screen, feeling a cold, razor-sharp smile spread across my face. Marcus thought he had won because he had the house and the bank accounts. He thought he was untouchable because he had Bradley corporate legal team shielding him. But they were playing checkers while I had been quietly setting up a grandmaster chessboard for 5 years. Sterling Naturals' flagship product, the serum that accounted for 90% of their revenue, was now legally classified as stolen intellectual property. Every bottle sitting on a retail shelf, every shipment currently crossing the ocean, every single transaction processing through their website was now a federal crime. And Marcus, as the CEO, was personally, legally, and financially responsible for all of it. I leaned back in the cheap plastic dining chair, the peeling linoleum and flickering lights fading away into insignificance. This cramped, roach-infested apartment was not my prison, it was my war room. The 90-day countdown had begun, and I was going to enjoy watching my ex-husband burn his own empire to the ground. I closed the laptop, feeling a genuine smile stretch across my tired face. For the first time in 7 years, the air around me did not feel thick with Marcus and his suffocating family expectations. I walked into the tiny galley kitchen and poured myself a glass of tap water. It tasted sweeter than any vintage champagne I had ever been served at their country club dinners. But my quiet celebration was abruptly shattered by the rapid, relentless buzzing of my phone resting on the laminate counter. The screen lit up with a barrage of notifications. It was the extended family group chat. A digital space. I had neglected to leave a space dominated by Marcus, Chloe, and my former mother-in-law, Eleanor. I picked up the device, watching the messages roll in one after another. Marcus had deliberately chosen this public forum to launch his next strike. Marcus, Maya, the director of Malik Robotics Camp, just called me. Your card was declined for his $500 enrollment fee. I thought you said you were going to handle his extracurriculars this month. I guess playing independent woman is harder when you do not have my bank accounts to fall back on. I was lying. We had a dedicated joint account specifically for the children tuition and activities. An account he had explicitly promised the judge he would leave open until the custody arrangements were finalized. He had frozen it on purpose, timing it perfectly, so my auto draft would bounce. He wanted to humiliate me. He needed an audience to witness my supposed financial ruin. The notifications kept popping up like rapid-fire insults on the glowing screen. Chloe, oh my God, Marcus, that is so embarrassing. Please tell me you paid it. We cannot have Malik kicked out of the program just because his mother cannot afford basic expenses. Eleanor, I told you this would happen, Marcus. You spoil her for 7 years, and she forgets how the real world operates. Maya dear, if you are struggling to feed yourself, please let us know. We can send a grocery gift card. The children should not suffer because of your stubborn pride. My grip on the phone tightened. This was their favorite game, the weaponization of wealth. I remembered when Malik was a toddler, and I had wanted to enroll him in a local community arts program. Eleanor had scoffed, pulling out her platinum card to pay for an elite private tutor, instead claiming my choice was too pedestrian for a sterling. They had spent my entire marriage treating my financial independence as a cute joke, a novelty they tolerated as long as I remained compliant. Now they were using a $500 fee to brand me as an unfit, destitute mother. Marcus was laying the groundwork to make his temporary custody permanent. He wanted a paper trail of my failures to present to the judge. Marcus, do not worry everyone. I transferred the funds. Maya, you really need to stop making promises to the kids you cannot keep. Malik was almost in tears thinking he could not go to camp. Let me just take care of everything from now on. You clearly cannot handle the responsibility of a $500 bill. I stared at the screen, watching the little typing bubbles appear and disappear as his family members typed out their agreements and their fake sympathies. They expected me to remain silent. They expected me to retreat in shame, or perhaps send a frantic pleading text begging for forgiveness. In the past, I might have done exactly that just to keep the peace. I would have swallowed the humiliation to spare my children any tension. But the woman who used to apologize for existing was dead. She died the moment Marcus laughed in that courtroom. I opened my banking application. Not the frozen joint account, but my secure private portal, linked directly to Phoenix Genesis LLC. The account held the accumulated licensing fees Marcus had been blindly paying me for years. The balance was 7 figures and steadily growing. I navigated to the camp payment portal. I did not just pay the $500 past due balance, I paid for the entire summer program in full, including the advanced materials fee and the optional weekend field trips. The total came to $4,500. The transaction approved instantly. Then I took a screenshot of the digital receipt. I opened the family group chat. The typing bubbles were still dancing across the bottom of the screen as Chloe prepared her next insult. I uploaded the screenshot. The chat went completely dead. The typing bubbles vanished. I let the image sit there for a full 60 seconds, ensuring every single member of the Sterling family had time to open it, zoom in, and read the confirmed payment from an account they did not recognize. Then I typed my response. Maya, the camp is paid in full for the entire summer, Marcus. You can keep your $500. You are going to need every single penny to pay your legal fees. Enjoy your last few dollars. I hit send. The silence from the group chat was deafening. I could almost picture the sheer confusion washing over Marcus' face as he stared at his phone screen. He knew exactly what my university stipend paid. He knew my personal accounts had supposedly been drained by the divorce lawyers. He had no logical explanation for how I had just casually dropped over $4,000 without breaking a sweat. A minute later, my phone buzzed with a private direct message from Marcus. Marcus, where did you get that money, Maya? Did you take out a loan? Are you putting yourself in debt just to prove a point you are sick? I did not reply. Let him wonder. Let the paranoia begin to set in. He was about to find out exactly how sick the situation truly was. My laptop chimed, pulling my attention away from the phone. Another email had arrived from Evelyn, my attorney in New York. The subject line was no longer blank. It read, L'Etoile Beauty Legal Action. I opened the message, reading the crisp legal text with a growing sense of anticipation. Evelyn wasted no time getting to the point. The French executives have officially halted the merger. They initiated an emergency injunction against Sterling Naturals 30 minutes ago. They are demanding a full refund of their initial good faith deposit, citing gross negligence and intellectual property fraud. Furthermore, they have leaked the IP dispute to the industry trade publications. The news will hit the morning financial blogs at 6 a.m. Sterling Naturals stock is going to open in free fall. I scrolled down to the second paragraph where Evelyn laid out our next move. Marcus will be desperate. He will try to liquidate assets to cover the hemorrhaging stock value. We need to move on the house and the personal accounts before he tries to hide the money. I am filing the asset freeze tomorrow morning. But Maya, there is something else you need to see. L'Etoile forensic accountants found a discrepancy in Marcus' offshore accounts. It involves Bradley. I leaned closer to the screen, my eyes scanning the final lines of the email. Marcus and Bradley had not just been arrogant. They had been actively embezzling from their own investors. They had been funneling a percentage of the liquid gold profits into a shell company registered in the Cayman Islands. a shell company legally tied to Chloe. They had built their entire lavish lifestyle on stolen money, and now the French auditors had handed me the exact map of their crimes. I picked up my phone and dialed Evelyn's number. She answered on the first ring. "You saw the email?" Evelyn asked, her voice practically humming with predatory excitement. "I saw it," I replied, pacing the small length of the linoleum kitchen. "They really put Chloe's name on the offshore accounts. They made her the primary beneficiary of the embezzled funds." Evelyn let out a sharp laugh. "It is textbook arrogance, Maya. They thought they were untouchable." Bradley used his sister as a shield, thinking no one would ever audit a domestic holding company tied to a fashion influencer. "By tomorrow afternoon, the federal authorities will have access to all of it. Marcus is not just losing his company, he is going to lose his freedom." "And Chloe?" I asked, thinking of the crisp white Chanel suit and the $5,000 check she had thrown in my face. "Chloe is going to face federal tax evasion charges," Evelyn confirmed. "The IRS does not play games with offshore accounts." A heavy knock sounded at my apartment door. It was sharp, aggressive, and entirely unexpected. I froze, my eyes darting toward the cheap wooden door. No one knew I was here. I had paid for the rental in cash under a different name specifically to remain hidden during this initial fallout. "Hold on, Evelyn," I whispered, pressing the phone to my chest. The knock came again, louder this time, rattling the door in its frame. Maya opened the door. A voice boomed from the hallway. It was Bradley. And he did not sound like the smug corporate lawyer who had mocked me in the mansion. He sounded frantic, he sounded terrified. I unbolted the deadbolt and pulled the door open just a few inches, keeping the heavy metal chain engaged. Bradley's face was flushed a sickly shade of crimson. His expensive navy tie was yanked loose and he was sweating heavily despite the cool air of the concrete hallway. He pressed his hands against the doorframe, gasping for breath as if he had sprinted up the stairs. "Maya, you have to call them off," Bradley pleaded, his voice cracking. He did not sound like the ruthless corporate shark who had threatened to have me thrown onto the street by security guards. He sounded like a desperate, cornered animal. "You have to call Evelyn and tell her to withdraw the injunction. We can cut you a check right now. We will give you 20% of the merger buyout. Just stop the French auditors before they hand their findings over to the federal authorities." I looked at him through the narrow gap in the doorway, my expression completely flat. "You mean before they hand over the details of the Cayman Islands shell company?" I asked, keeping my voice barely above a whisper. "The one registered under Chloe's name." Bradley's eyes widened in absolute horror. The remaining color drained from his face, leaving him looking like a corpse. He opened his mouth to speak, but no words materialized. His jaw simply worked up and down in silent panic. "Did you really think I would not find out, Bradley?" I asked, leaning slightly closer to the gap. "Did you honestly believe you could embezzle millions of dollars from your own investors, funnel it through a fashion influencer bank account, and leave zero digital footprints? You drafted my divorce papers to strip me of everything, to make sure I walked away with nothing but 3 cardboard boxes. You thought you were burying me, but you only dug your own grave." "I am begging you, Maya," he stammered, his knees actually buckling slightly as he gripped the doorframe. "They will disbar me. I will go to federal prison. Please, I was just doing what Marcus told me to do." I smiled, a cold, empty smile that did not reach my eyes. "American law does not protect emotional people, Bradley," I said, repeating the exact words he had used to humiliate me in my closet just a few days prior. "It protects the pragmatic. It protects the visionaries. You let your greed blind you to how the real world operates. Be a good boy, and leave quietly before I call the police and have you arrested for trespassing." I slammed the door shut, engaging the second deadbolt. I could hear him sobbing softly in the hallway, a pathetic, muffled sound that eventually faded as he dragged himself back down the stairs. I walked away from the door and headed straight for the small kitchen counter. I reached into my bag and pulled out a bottle of expensive red wine I had purchased on the way to the apartment. I uncorked it and poured a generous amount into a cheap glass tumbler. I walked into the cramped living area and turned on the small television resting on a battered wooden stand. I changed the channel to the premier financial news network. It was time for their highly anticipated morning feature. My focus shifted seamlessly from the bright television screen back to my own calm reflection in the dark window glass. I took a slow, deliberate sip of the dark red wine, letting the rich flavor coat my tongue. On the screen, the network anchor was introducing a pre-recorded exclusive interview that had been hyped for weeks. The screen cut to a wide, glossy shot of the Sterling Naturals laboratory. Marcus and Bradley were standing shoulder to shoulder in the center of the pristine facility, looking incredibly smug. They were wearing matching custom-tailored suits, beaming at the camera as the interviewer walked them through their supposed genius. This morning we are taking an exclusive look inside Sterling Naturals, the independent beauty brand that has just secured a massive $150 million merger with French cosmetics giant L'Etoile. The anchor announced, her voice brimming with excitement. Marcus Sterling, the visionary CEO behind the brand, sits down with us to discuss how he built this empire from the ground up. The camera zoomed in on Marcus. He held a sleek frosted glass bottle of liquid gold up to the light, turning it so the amber serum caught the glare of the studio lights. It took years of dedication. Marcus lied smoothly, staring directly into the camera lens, with practiced sincerity. I spent countless nights in the lab, formulating this product with my own two hands. I knew women of color needed a product that actually catered to their unique hair textures, and I refused to compromise on the science. This merger with L'Etoile is just the validation of a decade of blood, sweat, and tears. I took another sip of wine, watching him steal my life work without a single ounce of hesitation. He was so incredibly convincing. If I did not know the truth, I would have believed every single word falling from his mouth. The camera then panned to the studio audience where Chloe was sitting in the front row. She was wearing a brilliant white Chanel suit dripping in diamonds, smiling like she had just won the lottery. The interviewer approached her, extending a microphone. "Chloe, as Marcus' sister, you have had a front row seat to his journey," the interviewer said. "What does this massive success mean for him and for your family?" Chloe let out a polished, condescending laugh, tossing her hair over her shoulder. "It is honestly a relief," she sneered into the microphone, her eyes glittering with malice. "My brother has had to carry a lot of dead weight over the past few years. He spent years providing for a wife who did nothing but sit at home and play housewife while he was out building an empire. It is so inspiring to see him finally free of that burden. Now that he has dropped the dead weight, he is finally free to take off." I watched her smug face fill the screen, feeling absolutely nothing but clinical satisfaction. She had no idea that the luxury suit she was wearing was bought with embezzled funds. She had no idea she was currently the primary suspect in an international tax evasion investigation. The pre-recorded interview concluded with a triumphant shot of Marcus and Bradley shaking hands with the interviewer standing proudly beneath the Sterling Naturals corporate logo. Then the broadcast cut back to the live news desk. The anchor, who had just introduced the segment a few minutes prior, was now pressing two fingers against her earpiece, her face entirely drained of color. The upbeat morning show graphics suddenly vanished, replaced by a stark red breaking news banner flashing across the bottom of the screen. "We are interrupting our scheduled programming to bring you a massive breaking story regarding the segment we just aired," the anchor announced, her voice tight with shock. "We are receiving reports straight from Wall Street that L'Etoile Beauty has officially terminated their $150 million merger with Sterling Naturals." A live stock ticker appeared on the right side of the screen. Sterling Naturals stock, which had been steadily climbing all week, was completely in freefall. The red numbers were dropping so fast, it looked like a glitch in the system. "Sources within L'Etoile are confirming that an emergency injunction has been filed in federal court," the anchor continued, reading rapidly from a monitor just off camera. "The French conglomerate is citing gross intellectual property fraud. They are alleging that CEO Marcus Sterling does not actually own the patent to the company flagship product, liquid gold. Furthermore, unsealed court documents filed just moments ago indicate that federal authorities are currently investigating Sterling Naturals executives for the embezzlement of millions of dollars into an offshore shell company." The screen split, showing a live helicopter feed hovering directly over the Sterling Naturals corporate headquarters in downtown Atlanta. A dozen black SUVs with government license plates were parked aggressively on the front lawn. Dozens of federal agents wearing dark windbreakers with FBI and IRS printed across the back in bold yellow letters were swarming the limestone portico. They were carrying empty cardboard boxes into the building to seize physical evidence. We have confirmed that the Securities and Exchange Commission has officially halted all trading of sterling naturals. Stock the anchor, said, her voice rising over the sound of the helicopter blades. The company assets have been frozen pending a full federal investigation. My phone buzzed on the table. It was Evelyn. I set my wine glass down and answered, putting her on speakerphone. Are you watching Channel 4? Evelyn asked, the satisfaction evident in her voice. I am watching, I replied, leaning forward to rest my elbows on the cheap laminate table. The timing was absolutely flawless, Evelyn. Letting them air that arrogant interview right before dropping the lawsuit was a stroke of genius. The French executives were very eager to make a public example out of him. She laughed. They do not take kindly to being humiliated. Marcus is currently barricaded inside the executive boardroom with federal agents waiting outside the glass. Bradley is nowhere to be found. He came to my apartment an hour ago, I told her, watching the live feed of agents carrying out boxes of hard drives. He was begging for a deal. I told him to go to hell. Good, Evelyn said sharply. Let him burn with the rest of them. The asset freeze went through 10 minutes ago, Maya. Marcus' personal accounts, his investment portfolios, the joint accounts, everything is locked down. He cannot access a single dime. And the offshore accounts linked to Chloe have been seized by the IRS. I looked at the television screen. The news channel was now replaying Chloe's spiteful interview snippets side by side with the live footage of the federal raid. The internet was going to have a field day with that juxtaposition. She was going to become the ultimate symbol of arrogant foolishness. What about the house? I asked, keeping my voice strictly business. The eviction notice has been served to the property manager, Evelyn confirmed. Since you officially hold the deed as part of the patent infringement settlement, anyone currently residing in the Buckhead estate is considered a trespasser. Local law enforcement will be arriving there shortly to remove Marcus' new girlfriend from the premises. I smiled, picking up my wine glass and taking another sip. Destiny was about to find out that sugar daddies are significantly less appealing when their bank accounts are frozen and the FBI is knocking down the door. We have total victory. Maya, Evelyn said, her voice softening slightly. You did it. I ended the call and placed the phone face down on the table. I sat in the dim, quiet apartment watching the news anchors scramble to make sense of the absolute destruction of Marcus Sterling. He had spent years telling me I was nothing. He had spent years telling his family, his colleagues, and the world that I was a burden holding him back from his true potential. He was finally free of my dead weight. And without me holding him up, he had plummeted straight to the bottom. I pressed my phone against my chest and stepped toward the door, peering through the peephole. Bradley was a mask of sheer, unadulterated panic. He held his phone up, pressing the glowing screen against the glass lens so I could see it. Maya, please, he begged, his voice trembling violently. The French representative just sent Marcus an email. They are demanding a full, comprehensive audit of all intellectual property before the merger gala tonight. If you do not sign a retroactive transfer right now, the deal is dead and we are all going to prison. I did not unlock the deadbolt. I did not even respond. I simply stepped back from the cheap wooden door, letting his desperate, pathetic pleas echo in the empty concrete hallway. He was too late. The trap had not just been sprung today. It had been meticulously constructed, waiting in the shadows for half a decade. I brought my own phone back to my ear. He got the email, I said. On the other end of the line, Ms. Evelyn Davis let out a low, rich laugh that resonated with pure, undeniable power. It was the exact sound of checkmate. My mind drifted back, shifting away from the miserable apartment and the frantic lawyer pounding on my door. The memory played out like a cinematic sequence, the camera of my mind executing a slow, deliberate Steadicam orbit around a massive, polished mahogany desk. The atmosphere in that high-rise corner office was heavy, mysterious, and laced with an intoxicating sense of danger. Sitting behind that desk was Ms. Davis. She was a notorious, highly feared corporate attorney in Atlanta, a brilliant African-American woman who dismantled billion-dollar conglomerates for sport. She wore a pristine white tailored suit, her natural hair styled in an immaculate crown, projecting an aura of absolute terrifying authority. They took the bait flawlessly, Ms. Davis had murmured during that meeting, sliding a thick leather-bound file across the gleaming surface of her desk. Marcus and Bradley genuinely believe they secured all marital assets in the divorce decree. Their arrogance blinded them to the foundational architecture of the company. I had smiled, tracing the gold-embossed lettering on the file. They only see what their egos allow them to see. The truth, the ultimate secret weapon I had guarded with my life, was finally stripped bare in that room 5 years ago, when Marcus first started showing signs of extreme narcissism, when the late nights at the office became unexplained weekends away, and the financial discrepancies began to multiply. I took drastic steps to protect my children and my legacy. I did not register the patent for the liquid gold formula under my own name, nor did I register it under Sterling Naturals, as Marcus simply assumed. I quietly established a completely anonymous blind holding company named Phoenix Genesis LLC. I registered the patent exclusively under that entity. Sterling Naturals was never the owner of the billion-dollar formula. They were merely a lessee. I was their landlord. The licensing agreement you drafted 5 years ago is an absolute masterpiece of corporate sabotage, Ms. Davis had said, tapping a manicured fingernail against a specific page in the contract. It is brilliant because it hides in plain sight. I nodded, remembering the night I had slipped it into a stack of routine vendor contracts Marcus blindly signed without reading. The trap was a micro-clause buried deep within page 47 under layers of dense standard legal jargon. The clause was explicitly clear and utterly lethal. The licensing agreement would become immediately null and void if the CEO committed any act of marital fraud, or if the company attempted a merger, acquisition, or sale without the direct physical signature of the IP owner. Marcus had committed marital fraud the moment he moved his mistress into my home and hid our marital funds. And he had just attempted to sell the entire company to a French conglomerate without my signature. By legally divorcing me and insisting I had no ties to Sterling Naturals, he had activated the very clause that would destroy him. "When do we strike?" I had asked her, the anticipation burning in my veins. "We let them walk right up to the edge of their triumph," Ms. Davis had replied, her eyes gleaming with dark amusement. "I have a contact within L'Etoile legal department. I will anonymously forward them a discrepancy report regarding the IP registry. The French are meticulous. They will not ignore it. The plan was flawless. And now the final mechanism had triggered exactly as designed. Back in the present. The knocking at my apartment door had ceased, replaced by the sound of Bradley defeated, footsteps retreating down the stairs. He was running back to Marcus empty-handed, carrying the news of their impending doom. Ms. Davis' voice broke through my thoughts, bringing me back to the phone call. The representative from the French conglomerate did exactly what we anticipated, Maya. They sent the email to Marcus requiring a complete independent audit of all intellectual property before they step foot on the red carpet for the merger gala tonight. I walked over to the small window looking out over the city skyline. Marcus had planned to spend tonight celebrating his $150 million payday, drinking champagne and mocking my absence. Instead, he was about to face a room full of furious international investors, demanding to know why he was trying to sell them a stolen empire. The shadows were gathering, and the true owner of Sterling Naturals was finally stepping into the light. The rhythmic, sharp click of needle-thin stilettos striking the polished marble floor echoed down the grand corridor of the Ritz-Carlton. The sound cut through the muffled hum of the ballroom ahead, sharp and precise like a ticking metronome counting down to an execution. I walked with my head held high, my shoulders back, radiating a cold, absolute authority. I was wearing a deeply tailored crimson Tom Ford power suit. The cut was immaculate, the fabric rich and aggressive. It was the armor of a woman who no longer asked for permission to exist. It was the uniform of a conqueror. The grand ballroom was suffocating under a thick blanket of manufactured optimism and desperate denial, despite the federal raid that had gutted Sterling Naturals headquarters just 12 hours prior. Marcus had arrogantly insisted on proceeding with the evening merger gala. He had deployed an army of high-priced crisis management publicists to spin the FBI and SEC presence as a simple routine regulatory inquiry. He was banking everything on his charm, hoping to blindly drag the French executives across the finish line before the full truth of his crimes hit the public record. I reached the heavy gilded oak doors of the ballroom. I did not pause. I placed my hands flat against the polished wood and pushed them wide open. The heavy doors swung inward with a heavy thud. The immediate vicinity went dead silent. That silence spread outward like a ripple across a pond, suffocating the string quartet, playing in the corner, and silencing the nervous chatter of the corporate elite. Every single head in the massive crystal-lit room turned toward the entrance. I stepped over the threshold. At the far end of the ballroom, standing on a raised dais draped in white floral arrangements, Marcus and Chloe were in the middle of raising their crystal champagne flutes. They were posing for a cluster of industry photographers forcing wide plastic smiles. Marcus caught sight of me. His smile vanished instantly. His arm froze in midair, the champagne sloshing violently in the fragile glass. Beside him, Chloe's jaw physically dropped. Her eyes widened to the size of saucers, darting from my crimson suit to the faces of the confused investors surrounding them. The pale, invisible housewife they had mocked and discarded was gone. In her place stood a woman who owned the very ground they were standing on. "Security!" Marcus barked, his voice cracking with a mixture of rage and genuine panic. He slammed his glass down onto a cocktail table, shattering the stem. "Get her out of here. She is not on the guest list. She is trespassing." Two burly security guards in dark suits moved toward me from the perimeter of the room. I did not flinch. I did not even break my stride. I continued walking directly down the center of the ballroom, the crowd parting before me like the Red Sea. "I am not a guest, Marcus," I said, my voice projecting clearly across the silent room. "I am the landlord, and you are officially evicted." The security guards hesitated, looking back at Marcus in confusion. I kept my eyes locked onto the front of the room, where the delegation from L'Etoile Beauty was standing. Antoine Laurent, the chief executive of the French conglomerate, stood near the dais, his arms crossed over his chest, his expression a mask of furious impatience. He had clearly been dragged to this gala against his will, demanding answers Marcus could not provide. I stopped just a few feet from the raised platform. Marcus was breathing heavily, his chest heaving under his expensive tuxedo. "You must be out of your mind, Maya," he hissed, stepping to the edge of the stage, pointing a trembling finger at me. "You have no power here. You are nothing. You took the settlement. You walked away. I built this company. I built Liquid Gold. You are just a bitter ex-wife trying to cause a scene because you cannot handle the fact that I left you behind." Chloe stepped forward, emboldened by her brother's desperate bravado. She pointed her champagne flute at me, her diamonds flashing under the chandeliers. "You heard him, Maya," she sneered, though her voice lacked its usual venomous bite. "You are embarrassing yourself. Go back to whatever cheap apartment you are hiding in. This room is for actual players." I looked at Chloe, letting a slow, chilling smile spread across my face. "Have you checked your offshore accounts this evening, Chloe?" I asked, my voice smooth and conversational. "The ones registered in the Cayman Islands. Because my attorneys informed me that the IRS froze those assets at precisely 2 o'clock this afternoon. Tax evasion and money laundering carry a mandatory federal minimum sentence. I highly suggest you stop drinking champagne and start looking for a criminal defense attorney who accepts pro bono work." Chloe's face drained of all color. She looked as though she had been physically struck. She stumbled backward, her heel catching on the edge of the stage, dropping her glass. It shattered against the polished wood, but nobody moved. Marcus stepped in front of her, his hands balled into tight fists. "What kind of lies are you spinning, you crazy?" I ignored him entirely, turning my attention directly to the French executive. "Antoine," I said, holding out a sleek black leather portfolio I had carried under my arm. "I apologize for the theatrical nature of this evening. I know L'Etoile values discretion above all else. But you demanded a comprehensive audit of the intellectual property before finalizing any agreements tonight. I have brought it for you." Antoine Laurent stepped forward cautiously, his sharp gray eyes analyzing me. "And who exactly are you, madame?" he asked, his thick French accent cutting through the tension. Marcus Sterling assured us that he was the sole creator and legal owner of the liquid gold patent. "Marcus Sterling is a liar," I replied, handing the heavy portfolio directly into Antoine's hands. "My name is Maya Sterling. I am the brilliant mind who actually spent years in the laboratory formulating the liquid gold serum, while my ex-husband was out taking the credit. But more importantly for your legal department, I am the sole owner and acting CEO of Phoenix Genesis LLC." A collective gasp echoed through the room. The corporate lawyers in the crowd began whispering frantically to one another. Marcus' face twisted into a mask of pure, unadulterated horror. The realization hit him like a freight train. 5 years ago, I continued, my voice ringing with absolute clarity. I registered the chemical patent for liquid gold, not under my name, and certainly not under Sterling Naturals. I registered it under a blind holding company, Phoenix Genesis. Sterling Naturals never owned the formula, Antoine. They merely leased it from my holding company. Marcus has been selling you a house he was only renting. That is a lie! Marcus screamed, spit flying from his lips. He lunged forward, looking like he wanted to wrap his hands around my throat, but the remaining L'Etoile executives quickly stepped between us. I have the licensing agreements, Maya. I had Bradley review every single contract. We own the rights in perpetuity. You should have hired a better lawyer, Marcus, I said, my tone dropping to a lethal whisper. You should have actually read the documents you signed, instead of trusting a sycophant to protect your empire. I turned back to Antoine, who was rapidly flipping through the certified legal documents inside the portfolio. If you turn to page 47 of the original licensing agreement, Antoine, you will find a micro-clause I personally drafted and embedded into the contract I instructed. It is a standard protective measure for independent IP owners. The clause clearly dictates that the lease agreement is rendered immediately null and void if the CEO of the leasing company commits any act of marital fraud. I paused, letting the weight of my words settle over the room. Furthermore, I continued, taking a step closer to Marcus. The clause explicitly states that any attempt to merge, acquire, or sell the company without the direct physical signature of the Phoenix Genesis CEO automatically breaches the lease. By hiding marital assets, by moving your mistress into my home, and by attempting to sell my formula to a French conglomerate without my consent, you triggered the breach, Marcus. Antoine looked up from the documents, his face completely stone cold. He turned his piercing gaze toward Marcus. Is this true, Sterling? He demanded. Do you not hold the deed to the intellectual property? I, it is a trick, Marcus stammered, backing away, his hands raised defensively. She forged this. She is trying to extort us. We can fight this in court, Antoine. We can tie her up in litigation for decades. I promise you the deal is still good. The deal is dead, Antoine said, his voice snapping like a whip. He snapped the leather portfolio shut, holding it tightly against his side. You have completely misrepresented the foundational assets of this corporation. You have subjected L'Etoile to federal scrutiny by associating us with your embezzled funds. You are not a visionary, Sterling. You are a fraud. Antoine turned to his delegation. We are leaving, he commanded. Wait, please, Marcus begged, actually dropping to his knees on the edge of the stage, reaching out toward the departing executives. We can negotiate. I will give you a larger equity share. I will step down from the board. Just do not pull out. If you walk away, the banks will call in my loans. I will lose everything. You already lost everything, Marcus, I said, looking down at the man who had tormented me for over a decade. He was kneeling in his custom tuxedo, weeping in front of the very people he had tried to impress. He was a broken, hollow shell. Antoine did not even look back. The French delegation marched straight toward the exit, their security team clearing a path. The remaining investors and corporate guests, seeing the writing on the wall, began murmuring urgently, pulling out their phones and rushing toward the doors. The grand gala had transformed into a mass exodus of fleeing capital. Chloe was sitting on the floor of the stage, sobbing hysterically, her carefully styled hair ruined as she frantically tried to dial her useless lawyer on her phone. Marcus remained on his knees, staring at his empty hands, as the ballroom emptied out, leaving him entirely isolated. I looked at them one final time, feeling the last chains of my past break and fall away. I turned on my heel, the crimson fabric of my suit catching the light. I walked back down the center aisle, the rhythmic click of my stilettos, the only sound left in the ruined empire of Marcus Sterling. I did not unlock the deadbolt. I simply stepped closer to the cheap wooden door and peered through the small glass peephole. Bradley's face was distorted, a sickly shade of pale gray. His expensive custom-tailored navy suit jacket was wrinkled, and his silk tie was yanked loose around his collar. He was sweating heavily despite the air-conditioned chill of the concrete hallway. He pressed his palms flat against the doorframe, gasping for breath, as if he had sprinted all the way up the 3 flights of stairs. "Maya, please open the door," he begged, his voice trembling violently. His fist pounded against the wood again, lacking the arrogant rhythm he usually commanded. "I know you are in there. The French representatives just sent Marcus an email. They are demanding a full comprehensive audit of all intellectual property before the merger gala tonight. They want the original patent registry. Maya, if you do not sign a retroactive transfer right now, the entire deal is dead and we are all going to federal prison." I stared at his distorted, panicked face through the fisheye lens. A wave of absolute glacial calm washed over me. This was the brilliant corporate lawyer who had sat in my closet and smugly told me I was nothing. This was the man who had drafted the divorce papers designed to leave me destitute. Now he was reduced to a begging, trembling mess in the hallway of a cheap rental apartment. I leaned closer to the heavy wooden door, resting my forehead against the cool surface. I did not open it. I kept my voice low, steady, and entirely devoid of sympathy. "American law does not protect emotional people, Bradley," I said, echoing the exact words he had weaponized against me just days prior. "It protects the pragmatic. It protects the visionaries. You let your greed and your arrogance blind you to how the real world actually operates. You thought you could strip me of my life work and leave me with cardboard boxes. But you forgot one crucial detail. You never actually owned the company." Through the door, I could hear his breath hitch. "Maya, please," he stammered, his voice cracking into a pathetic whine. "Marcus will give you anything you want. We will cut you a check right now, 20% of the buyout, 50%. Just call off the auditors. We can fix this. I am begging you." "You cannot fix a house built on stolen land," I replied, my tone clinical and detached. "And you certainly cannot fix the Cayman Islands shell company registered under Chloe name. The IRS is already freezing the accounts, Bradley. You are too late. Now be a good lawyer and leave quietly before I call the police and have you arrested for trespassing." A strangled sob escaped Bradley's throat. I stepped back from the door, watching through the peephole as his knees actually buckled. He slid down the doorframe, collapsing onto the hallway floor. He remained there for a long, pathetic minute before slowly dragging himself upright. His shoulders were hunched, his spirit entirely broken as he turned and stumbled down the hallway, carrying the news of their impending annihilation back to his master. I lifted my phone back to my ear. "He got the email," I said, staring at the locked door. On the other end of the line, Ms. Evelyn Davis let out a low, rich laugh that resonated with pure, undeniable power. It was the exact sound of checkmate. "They took the bait flawlessly," she murmured, her voice a smooth, dark velvet. My mind drifted back, shifting away from the miserable apartment and the frantic lawyer. The memory played out like a cinematic sequence, the camera of my mind executing a slow, deliberate Steadicam orbit around a massive, polished mahogany desk. The atmosphere in that high-rise New York corner office was heavy, mysterious, and laced with an intoxicating sense of danger. Sitting behind that desk was Ms. Evelyn Davis. She was a notorious, highly feared corporate attorney, a brilliant black woman who dismantled billion-dollar conglomerates for sport. She wore a pristine white tailored suit, her natural hair styled in an immaculate crown, projecting an aura of absolute terrifying authority. The floor-to-ceiling windows behind her offered a sweeping panoramic view of the Manhattan skyline, but she was the most commanding force in the room. 5 years ago, when Marcus first started showing signs of extreme narcissism, when his late nights at the office became unexplained weekends away, and his casual dismissals of my contributions turned into outright verbal abuse, I knew I had to protect myself. I had spent countless nights in the laboratory perfecting the formula for liquid gold. It was my creation, my science, my sweat and tears. I refused to let a man who only cared about branding and profit steal my legacy. I had flown to New York in secret and sat in that very office across from Evelyn. I had laid the chemical breakdown of the serum on her desk and told her I needed an impenetrable fortress. "We do not just build fortresses," Maya Evelyn had said, interlacing her fingers and resting them on the mahogany surface. "We build traps. We build legal labyrinths that look like open doors." The truth, the ultimate secret weapon I had guarded with my life, was forged in that room. I did not register the patent for the liquid gold formula under my own name, nor did I register it under Sterling Naturals as Marcus simply assumed. Under Evelyn masterful guidance, I quietly established a completely anonymous blind holding company named Phoenix Genesis LLC. I registered the global patent and all associated intellectual property exclusively under that entity. Sterling Naturals was never the owner of the billion-dollar formula. They were merely a lessee. I was their landlord. Marcus' arrogance was his fatal flaw. Evelyn had noted her sharp eyes gleaming with predatory intellect. He assumes because you are his wife you belong to him. Therefore he believes your creations belong to him. He will never think to verify the foundational architecture of his own company because his ego tells him he is the architect. She had been absolutely right. When it came time to formalize the corporate structure, Marcus had handed the paperwork to Bradley, and Bradley, lazy and overconfident, had simply processed the vendor contracts I had slipped onto his desk. Among those contracts was a licensing agreement between Sterling Naturals and Phoenix Genesis LLC, allowing Marcus Company to manufacture and distribute liquid gold for a nominal annual fee. But that licensing agreement was a masterpiece of corporate sabotage. It was brilliant because it hid in plain sight. Deep within the contract, buried on page 47 under layers of dense, mind-numbing legal jargon, was a micro-clause. I remembered reading over the clause in Evelyn's office, feeling a thrill of righteous power. The legal phrasing was explicitly clear and utterly lethal. The licensing agreement would become immediately null and void if the CEO of the leasing entity committed any act of marital fraud, domestic abuse, or financial malfeasance. Furthermore, the clause mandated that any attempt to merge, acquire, or sell Sterling Naturals without the direct physical signature of the Phoenix Genesis IP owner would automatically terminate the contract and trigger severe financial penalties. Marcus had committed marital fraud the moment he moved his mistress into my home and began funneling our joint assets into offshore accounts. He had activated the first trigger, and by attempting to sell the entire company to a French conglomerate, without my signature, he had pulled the final lever. By legally divorcing me and insisting I had no ties to Sterling Naturals, he had locked himself out of his own kingdom. We let them walk right up to the edge of their triumph, Evelyn had advised me, her voice echoing in my memory. We let them print the banners, pop the champagne, and sign the preliminary documents. And then we pull the floor out from under them. The plan had been executed to absolute perfection. Back in the present, Evelyn's voice brought me back from the memory. The representative from L'Etoile just confirmed receipt of our anonymous dossier. Evelyn said, the satisfaction evident in her crisp tone. The French are meticulous, Maya. They do not tolerate corporate embarrassments. The moment they saw the discrepancy report regarding the IP registry, they initiated their emergency protocols. The email demanding the audit was just the first wave. The injunction is already hitting the federal docket. I walked over to the small kitchen counter, picking up my glass of wine. The liquid trembled slightly, reflecting the adrenaline rushing through my veins. Marcus had planned to spend tonight at the Ritz-Carlton, celebrating his $150 million payday, drinking vintage champagne and mocking my absence. He thought he had discarded his burdensome wife. He thought he was untouchable. Instead, he was staring down the barrel of a federal investigation. He was about to face a room full of furious international investors, demanding to know why he was trying to sell them a stolen empire. He had no patent. He had no product. He had no company. Are the federal authorities moving on the Buckhead estate? I asked, keeping my voice perfectly level. The eviction notice is being processed as we speak, Evelyn confirmed. Since Phoenix Genesis officially holds the primary lien against the property as penalty for the contract breach, anyone currently residing in that mansion is a hostile trespasser. Local law enforcement will be arriving to remove the new girlfriend from the premises shortly. Chloe is already flagged by the IRS. It is a complete tactical wipeout. I took a slow, deliberate sip of the dark red wine. The taste was rich, complex, and deeply satisfying. For years I had played the quiet, supportive wife. I had allowed Marcus to stand in the spotlight while I worked in the shadows. I had swallowed my pride, endured the insults, and smiled for the cameras. But the shadows were where I had built my power. They wanted to play corporate warfare. Evelyn, I said, my eyes fixed on the Atlanta skyline visible through the smudged window. I think it is time we show them how the game is actually won. Evelyn chuckled, a sound that promised absolute devastation. The gala is tonight, Maya. Marcus has to show up. He has to stand in front of the press and the investors and pretend the walls are not closing in. He will try to spin the email. He will try to buy time. Hi is out of time, I replied, setting the glass down. The invisible housewife they all mocked is dead. Phoenix Genesis is calling in its debts. I disconnected the call and walked into the small bedroom. Lying on the cheap mattress was a sleek black garment bag. I unzipped it carefully, revealing the immaculate crimson Tom Ford power suit I had purchased months ago in anticipation of this exact night. I ran my fingers over the luxurious fabric, feeling the sharp, commanding cut of the lapels. It was not just clothing, it was armor. It was the uniform of a queen stepping forward to reclaim her throne. The shadows were finally parting, and the true owner of Sterling Naturals was ready to step into the light. The rhythmic click of my stilettos was suddenly interrupted by the frantic scrambling of leather shoes against the polished marble. Marcus had pushed himself off the stage floor, moving with the clumsy desperation of a man drowning in a rising tide. He lunged across the distance between us, cutting off my path toward the exit. He snatched a half-empty crystal glass of bourbon from a nearby cocktail table, gripping it so tightly, his knuckles turned a bloodless white. It was a pathetic attempt to anchor himself, to project some semblance of the suave billionaire he had been just 15 minutes prior. Maya, stop right there! He barked, his voice, a ragged, commanding bark that echoed through the cavernous ballroom. I stopped, perfectly balanced on my heels. The entire room seemed to hold its collective breath. The fleeing investors, the lingering corporate sharks, and the stunned catering staff all froze, watching the final confrontation unfold. If this were a film, the camera would have locked onto us, executing a slow, sweeping 180-degree arc around our standoff, capturing the absolute inversion of our power dynamic. Marcus tried to tower over me, utilizing his physical height to intimidate me, just as he had done for a decade in the privacy of our home. But his posture was hollow. His custom tuxedo was rumpled, his silk bow tie askew, and a thick layer of nervous sweat glistened on his forehead. The man who had spent years systematically tearing down my self-esteem was physically vibrating with terror. I stood perfectly still, the tailored lines of my crimson Tom Ford suit wrapping me in an impenetrable armor of authority. I did not shrink. I did not avert my gaze. I looked up at him with the clinical, detached interest of a scientist examining a flawed experiment. "You think you have won?" Marcus sneered, his voice dropping to a venomous hiss, meant only for my ears. "You think a hidden piece of paper makes you untouchable? You are nothing but a bitter, vindictive housewife throwing a tantrum because I upgraded my life." I let his words wash over me, completely unaffected. The insults that used to paralyze me, that used to send me spiraling into days of crippling self-doubt, now sounded like the meaningless static of a broken radio. "I am calling building security right now," he threatened, taking a step closer, trying to force me to back away. "I am going to have you dragged out of this hotel in handcuffs for corporate espionage and trespassing. And then I am calling my legal team. I will bury you in civil suits until you are entirely bankrupt. But that is not even the worst of it, Maya." He leaned in, the smell of stale bourbon and desperate panic radiating from his skin. He played the only card he believed he still held. "If you do not turn around, walk up to that stage and publicly retract every single word you just said to Antoine Laurent, I will make sure you never see the children again," he growled, his eyes wide and manic. "I will file an emergency custody order first thing in the morning. I will tell the judge you are mentally unstable, experiencing a psychotic break. I have the money. I have the power. I will take Malik and the girls and I will erase you from their lives permanently. Now fix this. Fix this right now, or I swear to God you are dead to them." He stood there, breathing heavily, waiting for the devastating impact of his threat to hit me. He waited for my eyes to well with tears. He waited for my shoulders to slump, for the panic to set in, for the inevitable frantic apologies and the desperate pleas for mercy. He waited for the old Maya to surrender to his ultimate weapon. I did not blink. I did not frown. I did not even offer him the satisfaction of a verbal response. I knew exactly what his threats were worth. Nothing. His personal accounts were frozen by the federal government. His offshore shell company was in the hands of the IRS. The Buckhead mansion was currently being cleared by local law enforcement. He did not have the funds to hire a paralegal, let alone a high-powered family law attorney to drag me into a custody battle. He was a bankrupt criminal standing in a burning building threatening me with a match. I tilted my head slightly, offering him a smile that was completely devoid of warmth. It was a smile of absolute finality. I stepped forward. I did not go around him. I walked directly into his personal space, forcing him to awkwardly stumble backward to avoid a collision. I brushed past his shoulder, treating him as nothing more than an inconvenient piece of furniture blocking my path. Maya, he yelled, his voice cracking, pitching upward into a pathetic, humiliating shriek. I am talking to you. I ignored him, keeping my gaze locked straight ahead. I glided past him, leaving him choking on his own toxic, empty threats. My destination was not the main exit doors. I altered my trajectory, moving deliberately toward the massive circular VIP booth situated in the most exclusive elevated corner of the ballroom. Antoine Laurent had not left the building. He and his elite delegation had merely retreated from the stage, setting up a temporary command center at the primary shareholder table near the exit. They were frantically packing their briefcases and shouting rapid-fire instructions in French to their legal team, preparing to mitigate the catastrophic public relations disaster Marcus had just dragged them into. As I approached the heavy velvet ropes surrounding the VIP section, the private security details stepped forward to intercept me. But Antoine Laurent looked up from his tablet. He saw me approaching in my striking crimson suit. The furious irritation that had clouded his features just moments ago instantly evaporated. He raised a single hand, snapping his fingers. The security guards immediately parted, stepping back to grant me unimpeded access to the inner circle of global wealth. I stepped onto the elevated platform. The remaining executives at the table fell completely silent, their eyes locked on me. They were men who dealt in billions, who commanded industries and crushed competitors for sport. Yet in that moment they looked at me with profound, unfiltered professional respect. Antoine Laurent, the notoriously ruthless director of the L'Etoile beauty empire, did something that made the entire ballroom gasp in collective shock. He stood up from his leather booth, buttoned his immaculate suit jacket, and stepped around the table. He approached the empty chair at the head of the table, the seat of honor that had been exclusively reserved for the CEO of the newly merged corporation. He gripped the back of the heavy leather chair and pulled it out smoothly. He looked directly over my shoulder, ensuring his voice carried across the silent ballroom, striking Marcus Sterling with the precision of a sniper round. "Please have a seat," Antoine said, his voice booming with deep, respectful authority. "We have been waiting for you, Madam CEO of Phoenix Genesis. We have much to discuss regarding the true future of this brand." I stepped forward and took my seat at the head of the table, smoothing the fabric of my skirt. I looked back across the ballroom. Marcus was standing exactly where I had left him, frozen in a state of catatonic shock. He stared at me, sitting in the seat of power, surrounded by the men who had just stripped him of his entire identity. The realization that I had not just defeated him, but entirely replaced him, finally crashed through his arrogant delusion. His fingers went slack. The crystal glass slipped from his grasp. It hit the polished marble floor, shattering into 1,000 glittering, worthless fragments. The sharp sound of the glass shattering broke the spell that had paralyzed the room. Marcus stared down at the broken crystal, his reflection fractured in the spilled bourbon, before slowly raising his eyes to me. He looked completely lost. The polished, charismatic CEO facade had entirely melted away, leaving behind a terrified, hollow man. He took a hesitant step toward the VIP booth. The velvet ropes that had once been his domain now felt like an impenetrable barrier. The private security guards did not move to assist him. They looked to Antoine Laurent, who gave a curt shake of his head. Marcus was allowed to approach, but only as a supplicant, not a king. "Maya," he whispered, his voice hoarse, devoid of its usual booming confidence. "You cannot do this. We built this together. You are my wife." I did not let him finish. I reached into my leather portfolio and pulled out the thick, red-banded legal file containing the IP registry, the lease agreements, and the termination notice. I tossed it onto the center of the heavy mahogany table. The heavy thud made Marcus physically flinch. I leaned forward, resting my forearms on the table, commanding the space. As I spoke, the entire dynamic of the room seemed to shift. The glittering chandeliers, the massive floral arrangements, the towering windows overlooking the city. Everything around me seemed to recede, leaving me as the solitary focal point of power. Marcus, standing on the other side of the table, appeared to physically shrink, becoming small, insignificant, and utterly powerless. Marcus, you plan to sell this company for $150 million. I said, my voice projecting with chilling clarity across the silent ballroom. But you forgot one crucial detail. You do not own the formula that built this company. Sterling Naturals is an empty shell. As the 100% owner of Phoenix Genesis, I officially revoke your licensing rights right now. The words hung in the air, absolute and irrevocable. Marcus shook his head violently, denial still desperately clinging to him. We filed the paperwork. Bradley assured me the patents were secured under the corporate umbrella. Bradley checked everything. Bradley is currently hyperventilating in the hallway of a cheap rental apartment, I interrupted smoothly, because he just realized he aided and abetted federal fraud. He missed the true ownership registry because he was too busy helping you hide money from your own wife. He was arrogant just like you, and now you are both facing federal indictment. Antoine Laurent picked up the file, skimming the highlighted clauses with a practiced predatory eye. He nodded slowly, a grim smile touching his lips. He looked up at Marcus with absolute disgust. It is airtight, the French billionaire murmured, sliding the file back toward me. Madame, you have executed a flawless maneuver. L'Etoile has no interest in purchasing a shell company facing federal investigation. However, we are highly interested in discussing a direct distribution partnership with Phoenix Genesis. Marcus let out a strangled, animalistic sound. He lunged forward, grabbing the edge of the mahogany table, his knuckles turning white. Antoine, please, you cannot negotiate with her. I am the face of this brand. The distributors know me. The market trusts me. I am Sterling Naturals. They know the product, Marcus. I corrected him, my tone dripping with icy condescension. And as of midnight, Sterling Naturals has no product to sell. Your supply chain is legally frozen. Your warehouses are locked down. If you attempt to manufacture or distribute one more bottle of liquid gold, I will personally sue you for gross intellectual property theft and corporate espionage. He stared at me, his chest heaving, his eyes bloodshot and wide with panic. The reality of his absolute ruin was finally penetrating his thick skull. He had spent months carefully orchestrating my financial demise, hiring ruthless divorce attorneys, hiding our marital assets, moving his mistress into my home, and treating me like an obsolete, discarded piece of furniture. Now, in the span of 10 minutes, I had dismantled his entire existence. Maya, baby, please, he begged. His voice dropped into that smooth, manipulative register he used whenever he wanted to charm his way out of a mistake. Let us talk about this privately. Just the two of us. We are husband and wife. We have a history. You do not want to destroy everything we worked for. I made a mistake. I was stressed. I see that now. I will fire Chloe. I will tear up the divorce papers. We can go back to how it was. I will give you half the company. I looked at him, feeling absolutely nothing. No anger, no sorrow, no lingering affection, just a cold, clinical disgust. You did not make a mistake, Marcus. You made a choice. You chose to humiliate me. You chose to steal from me. You chose to replace me with a younger, cheaper version of a trophy wife because you thought my silence was weakness. You thought my patience was stupidity. You do not have half a company to give me, Marcus. I already own all of it. Chloe, who had finally managed to scrape herself off the stage floor, pushed her way through the murmuring crowd and stumbled up to Marcus's side. Her mascara was smeared down her cheeks, and her expensive designer gown was rumpled. She grabbed Marcus's arm, her perfectly manicured nails digging into his tuxedo jacket. Marcus, do something! She shrieked, her voice shrill and grating, entirely lacking its usual arrogant purr. Tell them she is crazy. Call the police, have her arrested. She cannot take the company. What about our accounts? My black cards are declining. The bank told me my assets are frozen. I warned you about those offshore accounts, Chloe. I said, not even bothering to look at her. keeping my gaze locked on Marcus's crumbling face. The federal agents are very thorough. I imagine they are currently cataloging the contents of your walk-in closet at the Buckhead estate. Marcus whipped his head toward me, genuine confusion cutting through his panic. What are you talking about? The Buckhead estate is in a secure trust. My lawyers locked that down months ago. It was in a trust funded by embezzled corporate capital. I corrected him, casually examining my manicure. Since you used Phoenix Genesis revenue to illegally fund your lavish lifestyle, my holding company placed a primary lien on the property to recoup the stolen assets. The eviction notice was executed an hour ago. You do not have a house to go back to tonight, Marcus. You do not have a bank account. You do not have a company. You have nothing but the suit on your back and a looming prison sentence. He opened his mouth, but no sound came out. He looked like a fish suffocating on dry land. The arrogance, the entitlement, the cruel swagger that had defined him for years had been entirely stripped away. He was left naked and exposed in front of the very society he had desperately tried to conquer. The corporate elite in the ballroom were no longer whispering. They were openly staring, watching the brutal, undeniable public execution of the Sterling Naturals empire. L'Etoile's legal team was already packing their briefcases, securing their documents, and signaling the absolute end of the negotiations. "You are a monster," Marcus whispered, his voice trembling with genuine hatred and profound despair. "You planned this all along. You sat across from me at the dinner table smiling while you dug my grave." "I did not dig your grave, Marcus," I said, my voice echoing with absolute finality. "I simply handed you the shovel and let your monstrous ego do the rest. Now if you will excuse me, Antoine, and I have real business to discuss. Security, please escort these two trespassers off the premises. They are disrupting my meeting." The private guards immediately stepped forward, grabbing Marcus and Chloe by their arms. Chloe began to scream, thrashing violently against the guard's grip, her diamond earrings catching the light as she was hauled backward away from the VIP table. Marcus did not fight. He went completely limp, his eyes locked on mine, wide with shock, as he was dragged away from the French executives and away from the life he thought he owned. I watched them disappear through the heavy oak doors, the same doors I had walked through just minutes earlier. The room remained completely silent for a long moment, the remaining guests absorbing the sheer magnitude of the shift in power. Antoine Laurent poured a fresh glass of vintage champagne and slid it across the mahogany table toward me. He raised his own glass, a look of profound professional admiration in his sharp gray eyes. "To new beginnings, Madame Sterling," he said, his accent rich and approving, "and to a much more competent CEO." I raised my glass, the crystal catching the brilliant light of the chandeliers above. I took a slow, deliberate sip. The champagne tasted like absolute, undeniable victory. The sound of the shattering crystal had barely faded when a new commotion erupted at the edge of the VIP enclosure. Bradley shoved his way past the heavy velvet ropes, panting heavily. He looked exactly as he had through my apartment peephole, a frantic, disheveled mess. His custom suit was deeply wrinkled, and sweat poured down his flushed face. He had clearly sprinted from his car straight up to the grand ballroom, desperate to warn Marcus before the ink dried on the merger documents. He was far too late. Bradley lunged toward the center of the mahogany table. He snatched the red-banded legal file right out from under the fingertips of the French executives. His hands were shaking violently as he ripped open the heavy cover. The world seemed to tilt on a sharp, unnatural axis as Bradley stared at the paperwork. His eyes darted frantically across the dense legal text, scanning the patent registries and the embedded termination clauses. This was the brilliant, Harvard-educated attorney who had laughed in my face. This was the man who had confidently assured Marcus that my divorce settlement was airtight and that I was walking away with absolutely nothing. Now he was physically trembling as he read the very trap he had blindly authorized. He flipped to the foundational registry dates, and the color drained entirely from his face, leaving him a sickly shade of gray. The arrogant courtroom shark was completely gone. "This was registered 4 years ago." Bradley stammered, his voice a hollow, breathless wheeze. He looked up at Marcus, his eyes wide with absolute despair. "A blind holding company. Damn it, Marcus, she trapped us. The intellectual property is gone. We own nothing." Bradley dropped the file onto the table as if the pages were physically burning his fingers. He stumbled backward, gripping the back of a leather chair just to keep his knees from buckling. His prestigious law degree had not saved him. He had been utterly decimated by the very woman he had dismissed as a clueless, dependent housewife. Antoine Laurent watched the pathetic display with cold, calculating disgust. The French billionaire did not tolerate incompetence, and he certainly did not tolerate being made a fool in public. He picked up his own leather briefcase, snapping the gold clasps shut with a sharp, definitive click. "We do not purchase a company that sells counterfeit goods," Mr. Sterling Antoine said, his thick accent dripping with absolute contempt. "You brought us here to buy an empty shell. You have completely wasted my time, and you have exposed my firm to severe federal liability. This transaction is officially cancelled." Marcus tried to speak, reaching out a desperate, shaking hand toward the French executive, but Antoine did not even acknowledge him. The billionaire turned his back on Marcus entirely and focused his sharp gray eyes exclusively on me. His expression transformed instantly from disgust to deep professional respect. L'Etoile Beauty operates on trust and true innovation. Antoine continued, projecting his voice, so every remaining corporate officer in the room could hear exactly where the power now resided. "We will cut all ties with Sterling Naturals immediately. However, we are highly motivated to secure the liquid gold formula. We will be working directly with Miss Maya and Phoenix Genesis from this moment forward." The ultimate transfer of power was complete. I sat comfortably at the head of the table watching Marcus and Bradley realize they had just handed me the keys to a global empire. Marcus stared at the empty space where his empire used to be. The reality of Antoine's words finally shattered the last remaining pillar of his sanity. His legs simply gave out. Right there in the center of the grand Ritz-Carlton ballroom, under the blazing light of the crystal chandeliers, Marcus physically collapsed. He dropped heavily to his knees. The loud thud echoed against the marble. From my elevated position at the VIP table, I looked down at him. He looked incredibly small, a microscopic speck of a man, entirely stripped of his manufactured grandeur. He scrambled forward on his hands and knees, dragging the fabric of his ruined tuxedo across the floor until he reached the edge of the velvet rope. "Maya, please," he screamed. His voice was a guttural, desperate wail that made the few remaining catering staff recoil in horror. Tears and sweat streamed down his face, mixing in a pathetic display of complete, absolute surrender. "If you do this, you ruin everything. Maya, you cannot do this to our family. You are killing the future of Malik and Zuri. I am begging you for the sake of our children, please." He reached out, grabbing the velvet rope, his knuckles white as he wept openly. He was using our children as a human shield, his final desperate attempt to manipulate my empathy. I did not feel a single drop of pity. I stood up from the leather chair, smoothing the front of my crimson suit. I walked to the edge of the platform, standing directly above him. I looked down into his bloodshot, pleading eyes. "I am not killing my children, future Marcus," I said, my voice dropping to a low, icy register that cut through his sobbing. "I am simply cleaning up the toxic trash left behind by their father." He opened his mouth to speak, but I raised my hand, silencing him instantly. "Tomorrow morning, my legal team will file an emergency motion for full sole custody of Malik and Zuri," I stated with absolute finality. "Your current financial status is severely in the negative, Marcus. Your bank accounts are frozen. The Buckhead estate is being seized by my holding company. You do not even own the car you drove here in. Tell me, Marcus, what family court judge in their right mind would allow 2 children to live with a bankrupt homeless man who is about to be indicted on federal fraud charges?" He recoiled as if I had shot him point blank in the chest. He let go of the velvet rope and slumped backward, sitting on the cold marble floor. The fight drained out of him entirely. He had nothing left to say. There were no more lies to spin, no more contracts to forge, and no more lawyers to hide behind. Bradley had already slinked out the back exit, abandoning his sinking ship. Chloe was nowhere to be seen, likely fleeing the moment the IRS was mentioned. Marcus was entirely alone. I turned my back on the pathetic, sobbing man on the floor. I faced Antoine Laurent, who stood waiting with a respectful nod. We had a global distribution partnership to negotiate, and I had an empire to run. The cavernous ballroom of the Ritz-Carlton faded into memory, replaced by the quiet sanctuary of my new penthouse. A Steadicam tracked smoothly backward, capturing me, sinking into the plush velvet of my living room sofa. I held a crystal glass of aged Bordeaux, swirling the dark crimson liquid, before taking a slow, satisfying sip. A soft, confident smile touched my lips. The silence in the room was absolute, a stark contrast to the chaotic implosion I had set off that night. The aftermath of Marcus's public execution was swift and merciless. News of the fraudulent merger and his embezzled funds broke the next morning, sending shockwaves through the financial district. Federal investigators raided the remaining Sterling Naturals offices before noon. Marcus was arrested entirely stripped of his wealth and dignity, currently facing a lengthy federal prison sentence for gross financial fraud and perjury. He had tried to hide his assets during our divorce, but he had only succeeded in handing the IRS a perfect paper trail of his crimes. Bradley fared no better. The arrogant Harvard lawyer was immediately disbarred, his license permanently revoked for his active role in concealing marital assets and orchestrating corporate fraud. His prestigious career evaporated overnight, leaving him a disgraced pariah in the legal community. As for Chloe, the reality of Marcus's bankruptcy hit her harder than anyone. Her offshore accounts were frozen, and the luxury life she had stolen was repossessed. The last I heard, she was frantically selling off her collection of Birkin bags and Cartier watches to cover her mounting legal debts. She did not even stay for Marcus's arraignment. She packed whatever she could carry and vanished in the middle of the night, leaving him to face his ruin entirely alone. But none of their misery compared to the absolute joy of my 90th day. The scene shifted to the pristine driveway of my newly purchased estate. A gleaming black Mercedes Maybach, my own golden carriage, pulled up to the front steps, tires crunching softly against the gravel. The heavy doors swung open, and the moment I stepped out of the car, I heard the two voices I had spent exactly 3 months agonizingly waiting for. Malik and Zuri bolted across the manicured lawn, their faces bright with sheer, unfiltered happiness. I dropped to my knees on the pavement, catching them both in my arms as they collided with me. I buried my face in their hair, holding them so tightly I thought my heart might burst. The custody battle had never even reached a courtroom. The emergency motion was granted immediately by a judge who took one look at Marcus's federal indictment and froze his parental rights entirely. My financial status was an empire, while his was a negative number. No judge would ever send children to live with a bankrupt homeless criminal. I had my children back, and they would never step foot in a toxic home again. The camera cut back to the present, returning to my quiet living room. I sat perfectly still, holding the gaze of the lens with unwavering authority. He thought stripping me of my home and my children would break a woman. I said, my voice steady and resonant in the quiet space. He believed that isolating me and humiliating me would force me into submission. But he forgot one fundamental truth. No one can steal a woman's assets if those assets are secured entirely within her own mind. I took one final sip of my wine, letting the cool glass rest against my fingertips. Build your empire in silence, ladies. Let them underestimate you. Let them believe they have won. And when the time is right, let your success be the most deafening explosion they will ever hear. The screen faded to absolute black,